Our intention here is to present our findings and our work on what we call the Jerusalem Old City Initiative, which was designed to find durable, sustainable, needs-based solutions to the problems of the governance of the Old City, which is situated right between, if you like, right in the center of the Israel-Palestine conflict, just on the old Palestinian side. And I might note that John de Chastelain is here, sitting in the front row, and John was one of our key partners in developing this developing the security aspects of this project, which are very, very important in terms of how this regime would function if it ever is going to be established. Having said that, and before we go on, I just want to say that this is the first event in a number of 6 which range over a number of questions affecting the Middle East. One is on Iranian foreign policy. One is on the one-state alternatives and their consequences for Israel and Palestine. And speaking there in particular will be Dan Kurtzer from Princeton University, who was very active with Barack Obama in formulating plans, theories, and approaches, particularly in the early years of his presidency. And then we're going to talk about, in another session, about states at risk. That's Jordan and Lebanon. States at risk because of the overflow of the problems of the governance in Syria and Iraq, specifically the question of refugees and what have you. And how these states are going to manage or survive these challenges. And we'll also have, towards the end of the series, an American speaker who will talk about American policy from the Gulf to the Mediterranean. So it'll give us an insight into how the Americans are managing this whole range of issues, probably focusing on relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. The dilemmas that they have in Iraq and Syria seem to me the most obvious. So I hope this is the beginning of a very interesting and challenging series. Now, what we've done is there are 3 of us here. We've all been partners in this enterprise. I should say that we anticipate that the findings from this Old City Initiative will be published very soon by the Routledge, the academic publisher, in 3 volumes, and will number over 1,000 pages in total in terms of the number of studies that we've had done and stimulated and what have you. That said, we are going to try to each speak about various aspects of this. Mike Maloy will first talk about the city itself and its ongoing issues. I'll then talk about the findings that we came out with in terms of our studies and our efforts. And John will then take a look at, and it may be most very important or most very relevant for those of you who are students who are interested in the kind of work that can be done in terms of, I wouldn't call it necessarily peacemaking, I would call it developing sustainable options for solutions, peaceful solutions to very complicated and seemingly intractable problems. And then Mike will have a few concluding words, and then we'll take questions from the floor. We'll try to keep our presentations relatively short to give you a chance to unburden yourselves about where you think we're going, particularly in the light of the recent troubles on the Haram al-Sharif, Temple Mount, and in the Old City of Jerusalem, in Jerusalem more broadly, where the overwhelming bulk of the deaths due to violence have taken place. I say about 85–90% of them, to show you what a powder keg it is. So let me first turn it over to Mike Maloy. Mike, I should say, is an old colleague of mine. We work together on any number of issues, including the famous refugee working group, Palestinian refugee working group, which had quite a life at one time, and I must say, long after I had departed, developed a whole series of very workable solutions for the question of the settlement of Palestinian refugees and in the event of peace between Israel and a Palestinian state. And Mike has been involved in refugee matters for a long, long time, including the Ugandan Asian crisis and the Vietnamese crisis. So he knows from what he speaks. And then John Bell, who is no relation, I should clarify. When we were in Cairo together, John and I served there. We also had another officer named Jamie Bell. So I used to say that these two guys were my sons by different marriages. And because it fit right in with the Egyptian culture and practice, so one rewarded one's family. Unfortunately, I never met either of these guys before I ended up in Cairo, but it was still fun to talk about. So, given that, I'll turn it over to Mike, and please go ahead and speak, Michael.
Thank you very much. The truth about these two is that John is, in fact, Mike's son by a different father.
And I didn't know until now, this very second. Yeah.
Just before we get going, I just go a little bit over the ground here to make it a little more understandable. I mean, most of the people in this room probably know a great deal about the Middle East, but it doesn't hurt to do a bit of a refresher for that. So here, we have, if I can get the zapper going. Here, of course, is Israel, and this is the West Bank. And Jerusalem is at the top of a long kind of ravine that runs up from the coast. Jordan is here. Its situation, of course, is it became an important city because this is where the famous David, who slew Goliath and went on to do other interesting things, established his capital when he brought together the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. So it was situated right between the two kingdoms, and so this became the thing. And this is where the land was bought for the first temple. So it's been the heart of the Jewish people for a long time. Here's an interesting graphic. The gray is the shape of the current city of Jerusalem. The dark gray shows where the Israelis live. The green shows where the Palestinians live, and you see the old city right in the middle between them. It looks like a little kind of diamond there. It's 0.9 of a square kilometer, and has more trouble involved in that 0.9 of square kilometer than most other places you can imagine. But it's the green line, which denotes the 1948 border, runs like this, with the old city being on the Palestinian or Arab side of the line, thanks to the efforts of somebody called the Jordanian Arab Legion, who managed to, in a very bloody affair, clean it out. Just a couple of other graphics on this. The old city, is diamond shaped. The Haram Sharif, or Temple Mount, depending on how you care to call it, is a very big part of this 0.9 of a square kilometer, and it's a totally artificial creation. It was built by the famous King Herod. It's out from the wall, from the hill that ran out this way. This is the Jewish quarter. the Armenian quarter, the Christian quarter, and the Muslim quarter sits like that. So that it just help you navigate a little bit as we go along. And that is where the 1948 border was, or not border, the green line where the fighting stopped. So so under international law, this is occupied territory, and this is Israel proper. And if I can remember which way to push it on. And there's a great shot of it from the sky. This is the famous Dome of the Rock, which sits on the rock where Adam was born, where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac, and from where the prophet rose up to heaven. So it's a very important rock under that dome. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the western or Wailing Wall is over there. You can see the plaza that was cleaned out after the 1967 conquest of Israel. And so it's a very small thing, and you can actually see the way the walls that were built by Suleiman, the Magnificent, or his architects, set it out and that's the city today. And you can see we'll use the term overlapping sacred space, and you can see it right here. This is the wall where Jews have prayed for centuries, the platform is up here, and right there is the Dome of the Rock, literally a stone's throw from each other, as we've seen quite often in history. So this wall is very sacred to the Jewish community. The platform itself and the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the dome itself are this third most important shrine or holy site for Islam. And this is what happens when people try to change things up there. There's always an immediate reaction. So I'll just go back to maybe that. So in late 2003, Michael Bell, John Bell, and I met to talk about doing something in relation to the Israel-Palestine conflict. Michael and I had just retired after long careers that involved a lot of time in the Middle East, and John, who was not anywhere near to retiring but was at loose ends, was available, and we needed someone considerably younger than the two of us to actually do the running and the thinking, so we recruited him. We'd all served in the Middle East, and we're interested in doing something outside the box that normally encases Canadian diplomats when they're sent to the Middle East. You're only allowed to do certain things because everything's so dangerous, even under adventurous governments. And the path through foreign affairs to the Middle East is covered by the bodies of young Foreign Service officers who stepped off the path. It's, there's not an issue you can touch out there that won't blow up in your face if you're not exceedingly careful. We decided on a project that eventually became known as the Jerusalem Old City Initiative, housed first at the Munk Center and then later in the Political Science Department of the University of Windsor. Our idea was to see if we could find some practical ideas that might be of use at some time. We were all on posting together at different countries, but in the Middle East at that time, we'd witnessed the destructive impact of the Jerusalem issue on the Camp David talks, where the parties came to discuss that and had not really done the research. The Israelis, we know for a fact, arrived without a single briefing paper on Jerusalem. They had to phone back to friends of ours in Jerusalem in the middle of the night to get something written up, and it's quite remarkable when you think they're not only are their chief negotiators there, but their prime ministers there. They hadn't given it any thought at all, and if they hadn't given any thought at all, you can imagine how well prepared the Palestinians were at that side. And we thought, having witnessed this, that we could at least do as well or better if we worked slowly and carefully with the idea that we weren't going to have to negotiate anything, but we could imagine negotiators being our clients, and that we could come up with research and maybe ideas that could go into their briefing book someday. When we started, a number of observers, including many of our friends at Foreign Affairs, wondered what the hell we were doing tackling such a complex issue. After all, we'd retired, we had pensions. Why didn't we stay home and manage the garden and whatnot? Well, the real reason Michael and I went was that the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem said to us when we first met him that once you're retired, it's important to remember that, and I'll quote him exactly, the woman thinks that she is the queen of the house, and you'd best be out of there most of the day. So we thought this was a bit of a blessing that we'd received. In any event, it is a complex issue. We had a lot to learn about Jerusalem, but we were not amateurs. Michael had spent most of his career in the Middle East, including 4 ambassadorships in Jordan, Egypt, and twice in Israel. John has roots in the area, speaks Arabic, and had worked as a diplomat for both Canada and the UN there. I'd had four postings there, and had spent the final years of my career tippy-toeing around the minefield known as the Palestinian refugee issue. And so, we had some familiarity. We knew the overarching issues, and we knew an awful lot of the relevant players on both sides and in the surrounding countries because of our careers and what we'd done. We liked the region, we still do, and we like its people. But the learning curve on Jerusalem was very steep, but it was fascinating. Jerusalem, of course, lies at the center of the 3 great monotheistic religions. It was the center of life and spirituality of the ancient Israelites, was the site of David's capital and the site of Solomon's capital. It was the site of the first and second temples and the focus of Jewish longing during 2 millennia of exiles. God might be everywhere, but the belief about Jerusalem which was picked up by a lot of people at the time, in ancient times, was that it was at Jerusalem that people could stand closest to God, more close to God than anywhere else on the planet. So this made it a very special part. And that belief was widely shared beyond the Jewish community in that part of the world. Originally despised by early Christians, Jerusalem became central to Christianity with the discovery of the key holy sites by St. Helen, the mother of Emperor Constantine, who subsequently made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Because of its frequent mention in the New Testament, it was and is central to the Christian religious imagination, was the motivation for the Crusades, which today remain as a scar in the Islamic collective memory. It played a powerful role as the Prophet was defining Islam. Early Muslims prayed in the direction of Jerusalem. It was the direction of it was the destination of the famous night journey. Where the Prophet flew to Jerusalem and ascended to heaven, except for the short interval of less than a century when the Crusaders held it in medieval times, Jerusalem has been in the hands of the Muslims for longer than the Anglo-Saxons have been on the island of Britain. And speaking as a Celt, that's a very long time. It is a place of long memories and deep religious attachments. Aaron Miller, a veteran of the American peace process efforts, once said, "Jerusalem is not about sharing. Jerusalem is about possession." And I think you have to understand that fact when you begin to think about what we tried to do. The fact that it has been conquered over 30 times in recorded history attests to that reality. Jerusalem is a place people want to possess. But interestingly, it has been possessed the longest by the regime that was the most tolerant. And that was the long Muslim ownership of the place. Was up until the last century, far and away the most tolerant of all the regimes, the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim that have held it. The fact that the Temple Mount, sacred to Jews as the site of the Second Temple, and the Haram Sharif, site of the Dome of the Rock, sacred to Muslims, is overlapping sacred space and one and the same structures, makes the issue of access, mere access, let alone possession, particularly vexing. And as if things were not complicated enough, Jerusalem is central to the mutually exclusive national identities and narratives of Israelis and Palestinians. It is impossible for either of them to imagine their identities without Jerusalem and its overlapping holy sites. A win-lose solution, and this is what I think one of the fundamentals that we came to grasp, a win-lose solution which excludes the aspirations of one side or the other is not a solution at all. It is simply the stage, setting the stage for future conflict. So it was to Jerusalem, this tangle of religious and nationalist longings, attachments, hatreds, myths, that the three of us set out for late in the spring of 2004. We were emboldened at that time by the reputation Canada had for its fair-minded and even-handed approach to that long and complicated conflict, and the knowledge. I don't know. I think you go back 10 years, you find it pretty even-handed, right? Compared, take your pick. We were emboldened to do this by the knowledge that, unlike the people of the region, we knew that Canadians routinely walk on water. It's simply a matter of timing. Over to Michael. Oops, there, you've got your mic.
Oh.
It's portable. Take it with you. Unless you'd like to leave it there.
Well, I might. Well, one thing that deserves note is the fact that in recent days, as we've already mentioned, we've seen a terrible level of violence in Jerusalem, in the Old City in particular. Much of it centered around the Haram al-Sharif, or the Sacred Esplanade, or the Temple Mount. We've seen violence before. We've had two intifadas. Some would call this present series of disturbances as the third intifada of Palestinian revolt against Israeli rule. And it certainly jars us, I think, even us who have been involved for a long time, and we feel helpless. But I think we also feel that more than ever, the issue cannot be abandoned to blood and violence, to the council of violence and despair, because this is going to solve nothing. Now, the ideas I'm going to present are not those that are on anybody's active list today. What we did when we started out was determine the best possible solution to meet the needs, the yearnings, fulfill the identity and cultural needs, religious needs of both sides over this sacred space. And we thought we could do that through a process of accommodation, which does not come naturally to the peoples we're talking about, where exclusivity tends to prevail. And that's why you'll hear today the Israelis say constantly, we'll manage it. It's ours, we need to keep it, we'll manage it. God, and among settlers and the ultra-religious, that God gave this territory, not only Jerusalem, but the whole of the West Bank, to the Jewish people, and they have a God-given application to preserve it. On the other hand, for the Palestinians, and more broadly the Muslims, to give this sacred city up and the area surrounding it is akin to betrayal of the heritage, their own heritage and their own belief system, particularly that once territory has been deemed Muslim or conquered by Muslims, it must remain Muslim in perpetuity. So this conflicts of interest is intensely complex. It's intensified by the physical overlay. I'll just go back to some of the photos here. Yes. by the physical overlay between the most important Jewish and Muslim holy sites. If we just move on again, that is the Western Wall, as you see, and that wall is indeed part of the Haram al-Sharif, or Sacred Esplanade. It's the retaining wall built by King Herod. And you can see from the crowds that gather there on a daily basis, particularly on Shabbat, the holy day, the intensity and the devotion which is given to it as a symbol of the Jewish people. Likewise, the Esplanade itself, which is controlled up until now by the Jordanian Waqf, or religious trust, maintains order there on condition that Jews not enter the area. There's right now, there have been periods when Jews could enter as tourists. That period came to an end with the violence of the Second Intifada, or Arab word for uprising. And the Israelis, for security reasons, restricted the age of those coming to pray from outside the Jerusalem boundaries to persons over 40, males over 40. So you'll see quite a few older people. You'll see, on the other hand, young boys and young men and what have you. They invariably will be from within Jerusalem city boundaries, where they compose about 35% of the overall population of the Israeli boundaried city of Jerusalem. But for our purposes, the complication is that this is essentially one and the same body, one and the same edifice, one and the same building. If the Haram al-Sharif and the Esplanade were down the street and the Temple Mount were here, things would be much easier, just as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is some distance away. So in terms of this physical separation, and of course in terms of the politics Christians may play in this, it's not really a factor. But we began our work in 1994 as a team looking for solutions, as Mike has explained. And we wrote, and others wrote, such as John de Chastelain, a good series of papers, which John will explain to you, dealing with a vast number of issues, from legal to security to religious to economic, social issues, and what have you, respecting what a special regime or a special administration for the old city would look like. Our conclusion was, first and foremost, that this city could not be shared, because the level of mistrust between Israeli and Palestinian, or Muslim and Jew, was so great that invariably any attempt to cooperate and to rely on their own security services to provide the necessary stability to make the city a viable one that met the needs of the various parties would not be sustainable. In other words, like most arrangements that have been made between Israelis and Palestinians, it very easily could break down, and we felt that it would break down. And so what we tried to do is create the idea of a special administration with a chief administrator who would be neither Israeli nor Palestinian, that would be chosen from outside the region, and who would govern with a team. I think we estimated at one time 350, 400 people who would function as security, police personnel, but also people in charge of zoning, a whole series of functions that Palestinians and Israelis could not manage themselves. Now, previous to this work, with very limited exceptions, the view had been that this problem was so complex that it should be left last in negotiations. Once you'd solved everything else, maybe you had enough goodwill, enough motive force and everything built up so that people would grasp the nettle on Jerusalem, specifically the Old City, and they would find a way to govern. And as Mike mentioned, at the Bill Clinton-sponsored talks at Camp David between Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat, there were simply no preparations made for the discussion of this issue. And this was the issue, or the main issue, on which the talks fell apart. The inability of the parties to grasp the nettle, to even discuss this issue. And we decided, the three of us, that whether or not a plan which we might develop would be implemented, and it's pretty hard to see right now how it could be implemented, that it could never again be said that there wasn't a viable option, a workable option. So the parties who could not reach agreement could look at themselves and they could look at each other, but they could no longer say, oh, well, it won't work, it's too ambitious, how would you do X, Y, and Z, or A, B, and C? Because we would outline some options which would enable them to perform these functions, or to have these functions performed for them by a third force, a third entity, which would be rather fair-minded in its adjudication of disputes and misunderstandings. Now, we did have a lot of influence on policymakers at one time. Prime Minister Ehud Olmert embraced this idea. Of course, when he embraced it, as one of our Israeli partners sent me an email saying, oh, so now this is Olmert's idea. But isn't that what we wanted all along? Which indeed was what we wanted. We wanted it to be their idea, not our idea. Unfortunately, Mr. Olmert got into certain financial problems which forced him to relinquish office and go to jail. But it was a serious lost opportunity. Ehud Barak, having left the prime ministership and coming back in a different government as defense minister, spoke about a special regime for the Old City as the only way to solve the issue. And we were down in Washington a couple of times with the Kerry team, who seemed engaged about the possibilities that this option offered. What bothered us there, or at least what bothered me, was the team leader, Martin Indek, seemed to have a fixation that they would just declare God's sovereignty here. And that would satisfy Jews and Muslims alike. Well, I at least, and I think my colleagues share this view, this is absurdity gone mad in the search for a solution. We did not aim for a permanent solution. What we aimed for was a permanent solution or agreed upon solution to all the other issues affecting Israel and Palestine, but a special interim governance arrangement for the Old City, which would allow for effective government, needs-based government. Now, we anticipated, as I will soon come to, that this would probably very much become permanent. what's the old regime? Or what's the special regime? A chief administrator with a full-fledged governance team, operating under the authority, and this is very important, of a Palestinian Israeli-based governance board. So here was our dilemma. We didn't want and didn't think that a system could be effective where Israelis and Palestinians actually ran the place. On the other hand, neither would accept to be divorced from it. So we thought the idea of a governance board where Israel, Palestine, and other countries that the two would choose would sit, would have certain overarching authority over the chief administrator and the chief of police and the Old City administration as a whole. So they would have broad powers but not too much power. In that they would drop the mandate in their peace treaty covering all of Israel and Palestine. A scenario somewhat like this, hopefully like this, as an annex to their peace treaty, saying on the interim basis until we agree to something more final, that would be final, we'll agree to governance on this basis. And we will choose between us certain key outside players who will be also members of this governance board. And Ehud Omer, for instance, mentioned when he was propagating his idea, or was it our idea? The idea. Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the United States as the other members of the governance board. Saudi Arabia because of its claim to be the religious center of Islam. Jordan because it had residual powers from when it governed the West Bank and the Old City of Jerusalem. And the Americans who would presumably exercise a fair-minded but neutral, impartial role in resolving disputes between the parties. And that the two parties themselves would incorporate that into their peace treaty. And on an ongoing basis, the governance board would appoint the chief administrator, determine the chief administrator's terms of reference, but not be able to intervene in ongoing governance. So we wouldn't have the Palestinians or the Israelis saying, you ought to be doing A, B, C, X, Y, Z, or what have you. They could say it, of course, but that would be beyond their mandate. They could go to the governance board and say, we don't like this guy for doing these things. Let's fire him and hire someone else. But we were confident, of course, that given the constellation of powers, Israel and Palestine and the others, that there would never be an agreement that would be earth-shattering in terms of changing the way the system ran. Now, some of the duties of the administration: security, policing, heritage. Heritage is a very, very important issue here in terms of the archaeology being used as a political tool to prove ownership. We were here, you can see from these remains, these remains, you, the other guy, you weren't here. This gives us a greater right. Access, how do you get into the old city? How do you get out? Planning for buildings, property registration. Property titles are very vague, very contradictory and what have you. The parties themselves, it wouldn't be just saying Palestinian property is Palestinian, Israeli is Israeli, because there's so many disputes and so many vagaries as to who owns what and how, that you couldn't rely on those parties to come to any kind of agreement, and that each dispute over property would become a would grow into a crisis which could threaten to bring down the entire regime. So what we wanted to do was ensure equal status for all in matters affecting Israeli-Palestinian interaction, the cutting-edge issues. Anywhere where competing national agendas could jeopardize governance. Now, we recommended the most civil matters like education, family law, marriage, divorce, remain the prerogative of national governments. Palestinian, if you were a Palestinian citizen, Palestinian law would govern. If you were an Israeli citizen, Israeli law would govern these civil law matters. There'd be no role for, and nor should there be, for an old city administration that was there for primarily security purposes to start interfering in the daily social and family lives of their residents. And we also recognize that there would have to be security cooperation between Palestine, Israel, and the special regime in terms of attempts to infiltrate the city, move in and out, for radicals to create terror incidents that would derail the agreement. Now, I'll just sum up by going through a couple of slides here. Okay, that's the old city. Those are the gates. At one time, it was thought by some that the boundaries would be best defined by this road that circles the old city. Others seem to disagree and want the old city walls. The virtue of all this was that the walls were very definite. You know, it wasn't a question of this yard or that being Israeli or Palestinian. The wall is the wall is the wall. It's pretty evident where it starts and where it ends. Now these are drawings from an architectural study that we had done of the Jaffa Gate, because we got into a lot of discussion, and people said, well, it really can't be done. You know, how would people cross in? How would they get in and out? You'd destroy the facade of the city walls by doing these things. So we hired a team of architects who, surprise, surprise, developed a scenario by which people could move in and out of the old city using modern security equipment to determine, you know, eye scan and what have you, whether they had a right to be there or not. And we determined that those who entered through a Palestinian-controlled gate would leave through that Palestinian-controlled gate. The same for Israel. So it wouldn't be a conduit to move Palestinians into Israel or Israelis into Palestine. Now, so you can see, I've got this here. You can see this is the Jaffa Gate. If you were going to enter the old city, you go in here, and there would be a security checks made here within this building, and you would come out and then be able to proceed into the old city. Here's another view of it. From another side, you'd simply go through, there'd be an exit, there'd be an entrance, and you would go through this process much as you would at any customs or international border, although it would be much quicker, we think. 32,000 people are resident of the old city. And through this process, they would move in and out, this being, again, the Jaffa Gate, the architectural project being, unsurprisingly, called the Jaffa Gate Study. Okay, now how does this all fit together in a way that makes sense? Okay, we have a bit of a schematic outline here. You have the treaty between the two parties. The treaty leads to the creation of the governance board. The governance board determines the chief administrator and the broad conduct of the chief administrator. He has an advisory religious council. Now, we did find that the religious authorities were not really that interested in cooperation. They were the least helpful of any group that we spoke to. But we felt that because of the religiosity of the city, at least symbolically, if not substantively, there would have to be such a council. We anticipated that they would continue to pursue the same practices and policies and take the same routes for their pilgrimages, etc., and prayer places that they had all along. Then under the chief administrator, you'd have the police, you'd have municipal departments, and you would have a court and dispute resolution, a set of court and dispute resolution mechanisms in cases where Israelis and Palestinians had clashed. In other words, if it was a purely Palestinian issue, Palestinian courts would take care of it, purely Israeli issue, likewise. But in these cutting edge issues, you would have a court system that would adjudicate, an international court system that would adjudicate intra or inter-Palestinian Israeli disputes. So that's basically what I have to say, and I turn it over to John, who can tell you the long story as to how we got where we got.
Or the short story.
Or the short story.
I had M&Ms for lunch. No, I have to stand up? Oh, put the mic down. So if I stand up, I think I'll faint. So if you don't mind, I'll speak sitting. I'm going to describe a little bit about how we did this, rather than what we came up with, as Michael just did. The first thing is, the analogy is that of a rock band. I mean, we were, the three of us, a bit like a rock band, and we made some good tunes. We also fought a lot, like the Beatles, so the process was interesting. In fact, this isn't just a joke, because the mix of our strengths and weaknesses, the three of us, made it work. Each one of us, as individuals, as diplomats, has certain strengths and certain weaknesses, and ironically, although it was not easy at some moments, the mix between us, I think, was frankly the secret of the whole process. Before I describe the process, the actual process to you, and I'm saying this because in real life it does matter, the nature of the individuals and how they interact and what they bring to the table. So there is a dimension of almost coincidence that our skill set jived to come up with this, I think, what is a successful process. As the other mics have said, I'll say it in another way, we sort of started, once we figured out what we wanted to do, which I'll get to in a second, we had three goals. We wanted to inculcate our ideas during our whole period of work. We wanted to have others absorb the ideas and, as Michael said, use them. And in most of our business and mediation or diplomacy, success is when other people take up your ideas and you're no longer relevant. Two, we wanted to co-opt people into the process. Our challenge right from the start, and in fact our foil, was Geneva, the Geneva Accord, which is a NGO-driven model of a solution to Israel-Palestine, which divided the old city, physically, and sovereignty. Israel, Palestine. And when we started, we had a lot of people saying, why this? Geneva's the answer. By the end of our process, a number of people who were hard Geneva people became more in favor of our model. So there was a co-optation process involved, as well as a national co-optation process, meaning to get Israelis and Palestinians to believe that these ideas are actually just useful and to get them used to them. And the third, which will come out in the books that will be published, I hope, next year, is to do quality research on the old city, which, by the way, had barely ever been done before. It's a major historical site, major political site, and I think we've achieved something in terms of building up a large body of research for people to refer back to on many, many topics, as I'm about to tell you. So our first task, though, as Michael just said, was to decide what we're working on, and that was not as obvious as it seems now. We had many discussions as whether we should work only the Old City. In fact, at the beginning, I even think we wanted to work only on the Haram Temple Mount. Then we expanded to the Old City. Then we thought about doing it beyond holy, because there are so many holy sites in Jerusalem outside the Old City. And we actually took a map and drew a funny dotted line around the whole area that we would work in. We even thought about walling that area in with a low wall. We were imagining a lot of things. We reverted back to the Old City and its walls, as Michael said, because that would just made the most sense conceptually and in terms of security. So that was a decision point to decide what we were going to work on. We then literally invented a process. None of us, this is a kind of what we call track 2 work. It's not official work, so we had to make it up. And none of us had done something quite like this. So we literally made it up as we went along, but successfully so. And I hope to try to explain to you what are the dimensions that led to that success. The first is maximum flexibility. And I think all three of us do share that. We realized that we'd entered a process that would require us to have a toolbox and then use that as required, both in terms of achieving our ends and in adjusting to context. The context kept changing on us, and I'll describe a bit of that. The political context. So there were periods when we couldn't work directly because Israelis and Palestinians were having serious problems and they didn't want to meet. So what we did effectively, in hindsight, this we did step by step, but now in hindsight it sounds coherent, is to have really 3 kinds of activities that then we used loosely or as we wished, as was necessary. And that is, we did an incredible number of consultations, which means just meeting with people, discussing and learning, usually 1 or 2 or 3 people, rarely larger. This went on for days, months, years, and it still doesn't stop. So consultations is probably the core, talking to people, finding out, learning and co-opting them at the same time. 2 is we did papers, research, product, actual papers and research material and policy products that we then used to either advocate or to do other events. And the third is events, whether meaning larger meetings, organized events, which were either workshops or larger. Workshops meaning, let's say, 10 to 15 or up to 40 people on an issue or on the large issue. And we would move between these 3 at will. Well, at will is exaggerating, but with a great deal of flexibility. Sometimes we would do all 3 at once, but we always reacted to what we needed in terms of the phase and in terms of the context. Whatever was required, we would adapt to, and I don't know how we did this, but the funders permitted us that kind of flexibility. So sometimes, and I think it drove some people crazy, we would change on a dime and decide we're not going to do this now, we're going to do something completely different. In terms of process, not of substance. We went through a lot of different phases. It's a long policy process. I've been involved in something this long, 7, 8 years, more, yeah. I have 6 different phases listed here that were somewhat distinct. The first was creating what we called a discussion document, which was a sketch of all the problems related to the Old City and the needs of both sides. It was a mechanism we used to get people on board, but it also helped us to begin to flesh out and outline our own ideas. But it was a tool. And that coincided with the hangover from the second Intifada. And we did it, it was difficult, but people were not laughing at us, but they weren't taking us very seriously. So what are you doing working on this issue when 2 or 3 years earlier, and the effect was still in the minds and on the ground, there were battles here. So that's phase 1. Phase 2 after that, and due to the discussion document, we managed to rally what others, even wasn't our term, called the A-team on Jerusalem, which is the best people who work on the city, Israeli, Palestinian primarily, but some internationals. We got them to Istanbul with the discussion document and took them to basically take it apart or to agree with it. And that, in a sense, launched us. And it's been, in my mind at least, the kind of the backstop and the basis for all our successes. We did manage to get the best people who work on Jerusalem from both sides into the same room again after the Intifada and after the failed Camp David Accords. And by the way, those people aren't that many. To this day, I still work on Jerusalem in Spain, and they are few. And there may be a new crop coming that I don't know about, but the number of Israelis who are really expert on Jerusalem, like the city, 5 or 6, yeah, and number of Palestinians, 3 or 4. It's not a large number who really can talk to you. I don't mean about archaeological detail, but who know the city historically, heritage, and politically. It's that combination that we require. Phase 3, we went on after this meeting to decide to work on security. This is where General de Chastelain came in. It was agreed by everybody that that was the critical issue that we needed to understand and figure out. And we got experts, third-party experts like John and others, to develop a model, and this is very important, in very close consultation with an Israeli security team and a Palestinian security team. But we agreed that the bottom line would be John's and his partners and ourselves as to what that security model would look like. And it's a very, very strong model and laid out in great detail as to how a third party can work in the old city. If I remember correctly, that was also the period when we had a problem with Hamas. In 2007, there was a mini war between Israel and Hamas, and that's one of those phases. Was it that period of governance where the Israelis and Palestinians refused to meet with each other, especially the Palestinians? And so we had to invent. No, it was the governance phase, the next phase. We had to invent ways of keeping the project going during that period, because they would refuse to cooperate. And that was the next phase after security, and that was governance. That's where we devised the governance model that Michael just explained to you. This was difficult work. Mike Maloy was a heavy lead in this, because it involved matching a lot of different viewpoints. It was really more, we were the hub, but we had experts, internationals, Israelis and Palestinians feeding in. And then for us to sort out that enormous amount of information and viewpoints into something coherent, that was not easy. At least it wasn't for me, Mike. It might be for you. The fifth phase, I would describe it, you guys might not agree, as one of slight confusion, because we had done the heavy lifting. Governance and security were the issues. And then we were left with difficult issues that we didn't know what to do with, which were specifically heritage and property. And property turned out to be the most complex, because property in Jerusalem is not clearly understood nor recorded. So people don't have deeds. The current registry is incomplete. Some of the documents are in Istanbul because of the Ottoman Empire. People have lived in homes for hundreds of years, but they don't own them. How do you sort this out? We had tremendously conflicted lawyers telling us conflicting advice. We did our best in giving a judgment call on both heritage and heritage was a little easier on heritage and property issues. The final phase, which I think capped and demonstrated our success in a way, was the advocacy phase. It was the most fun in a way for us as diplomats. And that's when the ideas got to the senior leaderships of all sides, the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the Americans. The Europeans knew all about it, but frankly, they were less important. I'll get to the receptivity in a second, but really the bottom line of this project in terms of success is twofold. One, the product is solid. It's a good policy product that can be used in a variety of ways. And second, it did reach the highest levels of decision making and was taken seriously. And frankly, in a way, there are only 3 options for the old city should anybody ever decide to do anything about it. One is to divide it in half, or 3/4 to 1/4. The other is our model, and the third is a derivative of our model, which is called special arrangement, not special regime. It's just not as complete as ours. You take parts of ours and you do that. So in a way, we've succeeded in introducing this idea into the minds of the decision makers, and I think we can take some credit for that. A few other important points that I learned in the process and that still define a lot of my work. We needed tension, not just between each other, but we needed tensions that propelled us forward. And these tensions were never fully resolved, but they produced the product. 3 tensions, really. One, between the Israelis and the Palestinians. That's the most obvious. They don't agree about how this situation should be sorted out. It was our job to use those 2 poles to come up with something coherent. But also, it required of us a pretty solid understanding that the 2 of them looked at it very differently. The Israelis either rejected our ideas or they understood that it's either what they have now or our idea. Which is why Israelis, frankly, move more easily to our idea. Because for them, it's either the status quo or something like this. This is sort of acceptable. For Palestinians, it's a different story because they're not in possession of the site. So therefore, this is, no, I want it. This is, according to international law and according to our heritage, this is our land. So therefore, why should I give it to a special regime? Therefore, Palestinians tend to think of it more as plan B that they don't want to talk about, but they will accept. But they don't want to admit it right up front. So that difference in political approach and methodology, we have to be very sensitive to. Now, there's an irony in all this. I don't know if any of you saw this, but last week, actually late last week, a few days ago, because of the current troubles and because of the dynamic that's happened since we actually stopped working, the Palestinians have now supported a French call for a Security Council presidential statement to have international observers on the Temple Mount Haram. The Palestinians. The Israelis said, no way. So, in a way, the realities that Michael has referred to, which is that there is no sort of nice solution, is even pushing the Palestinians who don't want these answers, they prefer to have theirs, to consider international dimensions. The international observers is a very small model compared to ours, but they support it. The second tension is between the role of a third party and the role of the national parties. That was a constant tension, trying to sort that out in security and otherwise. Who does what? And the final one, which frankly is highly imperfect, and we leave it as it is the tension between functionality, just getting the job done, which we focused on, and resolving sovereignty, which, we didn't do. We claim, we can argue about this, that our model is applicable under almost any sovereignty model or under a holding pattern where you just freeze it and you put the special regime in and it goes on ad infinitum. But we did not attempt to say, no way, this is for the negotiators, that sovereignty here belongs to this group or the other group. However, that issue is lurking all the time. The parties are most cognizant of that. Therefore, our solution is incomplete in their minds. The good news is, I think it's still good news today, is the idea, the special regime idea held. It's robust, it's strong. It held through initial criticism, middle phase criticism, and final stage criticism. And it's holding to this day. It may never ever be implemented, or may never ever be implemented as we have written it, but it could be forms of it are one day, because out of necessity. And that's the last point, and that is the lessons learned to me are 2. One is process, one is more substantive. The process one is such an exercise, dealing with such an issue requires enormous amount of complexity of process. There's no way around it. There's no way to just do this by getting people into a room and talking about it for a day. Nor is it a 1-year process, and it needs time. It took us a lot of time to get people on board. That doesn't happen in 6 months. It doesn't even happen in 1 year. It took 7 years to really solidify this into a successful policy model. And the other, and I dare say this, and I still believe this, and that is that we're a version of the fact that Jerusalem needs an international component in its solution. Many people don't like to hear that. Many people on both sides don't like to hear that. But in my view, I think in our view, the nature of that city, with its tremendous history, its tremendously difficult history, the symbolic expectations of people around it, which is probably the most difficult thing, is the way people think about Jerusalem all around the world, not just Israelis and Palestinians, demand another dimension to its solution than purely the national. The purely national, in my view, won't work. In fact, I don't think, if they won't get to the special regime, they'll never get to the purely national. It's too difficult. The holy sites are the strongest highlight of that, but the whole city's like that. How do you, I mean, a simple question, and this is out there, and a very close friend of ours who's the expert on Jerusalem, on the Israeli side, Danny Seidemann, he would now, chop our heads off from what I'm about to say, but how do you divide that city again, physically? It's very difficult. It was physically divided until 67. If you're going to physically divide it again, you're rupturing it. How and where? Danny, if he was here, he would tell you it's doable. I don't agree with him. And I should tell you that in the Kerry process, interestingly, unlike the Camp David process, the idea of dividing Jerusalem began to be cast aside. There was very little talk on refugees in the Kerry process, if any. There was talk about Jerusalem at various levels, and the ideas put forward were they involved special regime ideas, but they did not involve dividing the city anymore. They wanted formulas where it was open somehow to both sides. Both sides wanted that. Anyway, I think I've covered the ground. We'll open it up now. Yep. Mike?
Can I have the mic?
Sure. This mic?
Can I have the mic, Mike? Okay, we'll open it up for questions. Just a couple of comments, maybe to pull a few things together. One, I remember our first call on a guy by the name of Gilad Shaer, Brigadier General in the Israeli reserves, fought in all the wars, famous lawyer, chief negotiator for Barak, and it took us a lot of effort to get in to see him. He's in this huge building, and I swear to God, he came in wearing a pair of jeans that cost more than my family has made since we arrived in 1900. And it was agreed that, if we didn't get our ideas out rapidly, he would, we'd lose him. So we had a really tight little script, 3 minutes, bang, 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 bang. But halfway through, he gets up and he starts pacing up and down by this table. We're all sitting on the other side. And he's pacing up and down, up and down, up and down. And finally, he slams himself down into the chair and he said, we had something like 50 meetings with the Palestinians after the collapse of Camp David on Jerusalem. Nobody came up with this idea. I'm your Israeli lawyer from now on. So, that was the first little clue that we had that maybe we were onto something. The other interesting thing about the process is that the time it took was that we would feed ideas in, and it might be 3 years later that one of the Israelis and Palestinian partners would get up in a meeting and our idea would come out. And one of the ways we expedited that, and this was, I think, John's invention, was that we started using a lot of our money to actually take the partners and say, well, look, supposing the Israelis suppose you got a commission from your government to set up a police force in the old city. Here's some money, go design it. And then John and his partners, and we do the same with the Palestinians. And one of the things we discovered was that it's cheap to throw ideas around when you're sitting across the table from us. When somebody gives you $10,000 or $15,000 and say, write it out, you have to engage your mind. And little by little, they co-opted. As the process drew to an end, we had a couple of interesting bumps. One was, at one stage, as the governance thing was coming along, was the Palestinians who were actually from the negotiation unit said to us, our instructions are that we can't deal with you anymore. And we were quite shocked, and they said, this is too much like negotiations. And we don't have authority to negotiate, so just go ahead with what you're doing. And the other was when both sides told us, enough for the consultations, go away and write your paper. And we knew then that we had pushed them as far as we possibly could. The interesting finale of it all was going to Washington to present this idea to about 300 or 400 people, including people from the Israeli and Palestinian lobby groups. And designing it, I think, really cleverly, where we got up and were introduced, and then all the ideas were actually presented by Israelis and Palestinians. And Americans, so that it was all our work, but it looked like it was all their work. So, anyways, I think it was about as deep as it goes. Open for questions now. No time for questions?
Oh.
Read the book. Thank you for your patience. If we could want to talk in the hall a little bit later, we'd be glad to do so. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. Thank you for your patience.